So it's time to start. The poor governor's going to have a heart attack here. It's time to start a new tradition. That when I come to Globes, in the other chair, instead of the president, or maybe, but hopefully we start this year, and I need your enthusiasm here as you bring her up. A new tradition as I welcome on stage the Governor of the Bank of Israel. Governor, the new tradition starts. Please. All right. Let's be absolutely clear about this. The governor is not about, for anybody who is sitting there waiting, the governor is not about to tell us when she's raising interest rates. Do you want to just say anything? Because everybody's waiting to see what you're going to say on that. So do you want to just say it and get anything you want to say on that done and dusted?
No, I agree with you. Don't hold your breath. I'm not going to tell you when I'm going to raise interest rates. Let's move on.
Right. When the governor says, let's move on, you move on. The question of the Israeli economy at the moment, I was reading your recent speeches on the Israeli economy, and by and large, you seem to be suggesting the economy, whilst by no means perfect, is certainly the Goldilocks economy at the moment, not too hot, not too slow. You seem relatively not self-satisfied, but content.
Yeah, I think the macroeconomic situation in Israel, especially when you take into account the global economic situation, is definitely, we're in a good situation. Our economy is growing, modestly, but growing, and our labor market is very strong. We have growth of employment. Unemployment is at a record low, wages are going up. So in terms of a macroeconomic situation, we're okay. That means that we should focus on longer term issues, and that's also, I'm sure you read in my speeches.
I did, and we'll come to longer term issues in a moment. I just want to focus on the very short term, because if a President Trump embarks on a quite what some believe is a dramatic fiscal expansionary policy, no longer does it become, as Mohammed El-Arian says, the only game in town for the Fed. The Fed raises rates, the ECB is continuing with more QE of a fashion. Where does that leave Israel?
Well, first of all, regarding the US, if the policies that will be followed will imply stronger recovery of the US economy, that's good news for Israel. Because as a small open economy, we're very dependent on our major trading partners. US is a major trading partner. So it very much depends on how the policies will affect the US economy. The European economy is still very slow. It's, again, another very important market for us. And that obviously is bad news for us in terms of the demand for our goods and services.
But do you, obviously these are always challenging times, do you believe you're in for a particularly challenging time if the US and the Europe are going in opposite directions and you're in the middle?
Yeah, actually we are really in the middle, and in that sense we can't react differently to the different parts of the world, but we will react to actually how all of that plays in the Israeli economy. So at the end of the day, when we set our policies, we look not at what other central banks are doing, but in how it affects the main forces in our economy, both in terms of inflation and in terms of activity.
On the question of jobs at the moment, of course, you're right. Israel's just about, I mean, I'm sure there'll be some people who will always say, you know, the underemployment, the labor participation, but de facto, you're at full employment almost.
We're close to full employment. We don't know exactly where full employment is, but we're certainly close there. We see actually some shortages of labor in certain areas, in certain branches of the economy. Wages are moving up, so there are all the indications that the labor market is approaching full employment.
In that in that scenario, you just mentioned about the need to look at longer term issues. I am always surprised when I come to Israel that the first thing people are talking about and repeatedly talking about, and there were demonstrations a few years ago, is inequality. What can the central bank do on the questions of inequality?
Well, the central bank in our monetary policy cannot do much about inequality, but as you know, in Israel, the central bank governor is also the economic advisor to the government. And in that respect, we talk quite a bit about the main policies that should be taken in order to reduce inequality. And I think here we have to look at both longer-term issues, where I think the key element of reducing inequality is education at the various levels, and I can expand on that. And in the shorter run, I think we have to equip the current labor force, and there are many people without the skills that actually provide them gainful employment. And their vocational training and earned income tax credit are the kind of policies that can reduce the inequality in the labor market of people who already maybe didn't come with the right basic skills from the education system.
As economic advisor, you'll be well familiar that the moment you talk about macroeconomic structural reform, government ministers' eyes glaze over, don't they? I mean, you're a diplomat, you won't say that. But they want, what do I do now? What's going to get inequality down next week, next month, next year? They don't want to know what's going to happen in next generation.
Yeah, I think the challenge really is to convince the system to take longer term or to tackle longer term issues. I think that, and in our case, because the macroeconomic situation is relatively good, I think it makes the case for actually starting to deal with the long term now. And that's difficult. I think they're
only thinking about the next election, Governor. You're thinking about 3 generations down the road.
I think we should look at various horizons. And as I mentioned, for example, earned income tax credit, which is a very effective tool to reduce inequality or to improve the situation of people at the lower brackets of income who are working. And actually, I think correctly, the government strategy is to get people into the labor market and actually to get employed. And we've made a lot of progress in increasing the participation rate and the employment rate. The problem is that a lot of the people who came into the labor market don't come with the right skills, and that's something that we have to deal with now.
Do you get on with the finance minister?
We've actually worked very closely together in promoting financial sector reform, and we're now at the final stages of actually the legislation of this reform. I think a lot of agreements have been reached in finding the reform that will advance competition on the one hand, but also do it in a way that will ensure that the stability of the financial system is maintained. So there are still some small differences that we have to iron out, but I think the agreements are very broad, and the importance now is really to actually finalize the legislation and start implementing those reforms. And let me say one more word. I think there are a lot of initiatives to do more, and I think that it's important at some stage, when you do intend to implement a very substantial reform, to start with the implementation and let the system digest the changes, and there are major changes in the system, and sort of slow down with the extra initiatives that are daily actually brought up.
Right, because the fear is, and we've seen it in many cases, is that politicians love to do things, or at least they love to say they're going to do things. and more gets onto the table, and the agenda becomes overloaded. Now you say, and we've heard the speech this morning from the CEO of the bank, and we've heard it in this last panel, and we've heard it from your own banking supervisor. Basically, your message is what? Let us do what we've done.
Let us finalize the legislation and start focusing on the implementation. There are a lot of changes that the system and the banks and the different players will have to deal with and digest, and I think we have to slow down with additional initiatives that I think it's important to sort of now slow down and just focus on the implementation, yes.
How difficult will this implementation be? Because the banking sector, I mean, let's face it, the banks nearly brought down the entire global economy in the United States and in Europe. You tinker with the banks at your peril. Would you agree?
First of all, I want to stress that in Israel, the banks remained sound, and there was they actually were very, I would say, stabilizing factor during the financial crisis. And the banks here are supervised very closely, they're conservative, and I think in that sense they were a stabilizing factor during the very stormy days of the financial crisis. We want to improve the level of competition in those segments where it's insufficient, and that's why we're introducing some changes that will create new players within the financial system. But I think the important thing is to also not forget that financial players can be potentially prone to crisis and to instability, and therefore the financial reform that was designed struck a balance, and I think a correct balance, between enhancing competition while keeping a very close eye on financial stability and not creating any potential for destabilization in the future.
You recently had your colleagues from around the world here, various other central bankers. Now, there's one thing, I mean, central bankers have a unique role. I mean, you say one word and a market moves in one particular direction, and you're aware of this. You're also aware that most central bankers don't like to speak too much in public, correct?
That's very true. Including this central banker, yeah.
For good reason, for good reason. But what did your other central bankers tell you? What did you learn from those who you hosted here?
Well, we hosted the central bankers, about 20 of them from East Europe and from Asia. And obviously we discussed how the global economy affects us all, and everybody has their own concerns. But the two issues that we have actually brought to the table were cyber security and the challenges that are faced by central banks across the globe and bankers as well. Given the advancement of new technologies, how to deal with the enhanced cyber security
Right,
challenge.
Now when the central bank of Bangladesh can lose X billion dollars from the New York Fed. It wasn't sort of out the back door, because the SWIFT system wasn't compromised. The system wasn't compromised, but the poor security at the bank led it to be compromised. That's very worrying, isn't it?
It certainly is, and we actually do, and the banking supervision in our, which is at the central bank, is doing a lot of work on how to deal with the old and new cybersecurity challenges. We do a lot of practices of these changes. We analyze technological advancements, what are the risks and what are the cyber risks that have to be dealt with. We do a lot of work on that.
If you had a message to chief executives today about cybersecurity from what you know about how their companies are at risk, what would it be?
It would be that every new technology every new advancement in technology that you are thinking of adopting, you have to analyze very careful what risks it entails and how you deal with that. And that should be a very important part of the discussion on the adoption of any new technology and existing technology. And you have to check yourself, you have to share information, and there is a lot of work in that area.
As we come to the end of our time, I just want to touch back to this idea of the changes taking place in the Israeli economy at the moment. You do have interest rates at record lows. You know, we can arguably debate the merits of negative rates. Where do you stand on that? I mean, you haven't had to go there yet, but where do you have a view on them? I mean, on negative rates, if necessary.
The key is if necessary. And I think there are risks that are associated with very low rates and certainly with negative rates. And if you can get to the right point without going that route, which has a lot of uncertainty around it, I think it's better not to. And I think that for the Israeli economy, we didn't have to go as far as going to that unconventional path.
Mohammed Al-Arian describes central bankers as being the only game in town. He's referring pretty much to 9, 10, 11, and 12. Now, clearly, Trump is going to help you out. You have a mildly expansionary budget in Israel that is going to help you out in this country. Do you feel a little bit less all alone?
I think that actually in the case of Israel, we're not exactly the only game in town, unlike in some European countries and some other places where really the only game in town is the central bank. In our case, as you mentioned, the budget and the fiscal policy has been also supportive, mildly expansionary and supportive of economic policy. I think here the main challenge for fiscal policy is really the longer term issues that we've discussed. I think it has to do with the composition of spending.
Infrastructure. You love infrastructure.
Infrastructure, education. I think this is a very important infrastructure. I mean, providing people with the skills that will help them be productive. I think we have a huge challenge on productivity. And I think the main issues are really infrastructure, education, vocational training, and regulation, where I think there is also quite a lot to do in reducing the, I would say, inconsistencies and somewhere over-regulation of the Israeli business environment.
Final question, Governor. You have this unique job. You're the advisor to the government, and you can't really talk too much about what you advise them. You are the governor of the Bank of Israel, and you can't really talk too much about what you're doing there because that affects interest rates. You are attacked just about every time by everybody, in every way, at some point in the governor's role. Why do you want the job, and are you enjoying it?
Well, actually, I am enjoying it. I'm enjoying it more than in the beginning. And even the fact that I actually sit and chat with you, I think 2 or 3 years ago, I would probably be much more nervous about it. So there is a learning by doing, and it's a great job.
Are you and I starting a new tradition here?
Hopefully.
The governor, ladies and gentlemen.